Hello! Today I'm taking a brief return to Final Fantasy XVI, and following the updates that dropped pretty much the day after my initial episode discussing the title, I'm revising some of my earlier thoughts around how the game may frame its UI design, and particularly its battle system design, in light of party members now being an aspect of gameplay. Now, there are two threads of information that people have focused on, which is the news that Final Fantasy XVI will feature a party of characters to assist the hero character on their quest, and also the attention on game designer Ryota Suzuki, who's on the Final Fantasy XVI team, and whose resume includes various fighting game titles, Onimusha titles, Devil May Cry, and perhaps most significantly, with regard to Final Fantasy XVI, the curious ARPG Dragon's Dogma, which at the time of its release, 2011 I think, kind of flew under the radar for a lot of people, including myself, but it has since grown in repute and it has some renewed attention on it, owing to its upcoming sequel, which Capcom has confirmed, and also with regards to Suzuki's involvement with Final Fantasy XVI. But moving on, and turning to the consideration of party system design, the announcement that Final Fantasy XVI will be a fellowship adventure is welcome news for many fans. But it's also interesting to consider when we look at the gameplay footage and the UI design that we've seen of Final Fantasy XVI so far. Now, firstly, as a huge caveat, is that Final Fantasy XVI isn't due for release for another year, and while I'd be surprised that any fundamental design patterns might change this late in the production cycle, it can and does happen, so maybe what we've seen thus far from the trailers is subject to change. But looking at the gameplay, and particularly the UI and heads-up display that we've seen of combat thus far, it's very singularly focused on the player character's status. The top left indicates HP, summons, and other statistics. The top right indicates targeted enemies, or possibly boss status. The bottom left and bottom right is dedicated to commands and controls and abilities. So it's very much an action-centric layout. It's not something that lends itself to party-based RPG design, and it's very much in the arena of, as I say, action-adventure games, beat-em-up games, in how it's displaying system status to players. And thinking about party-based games, and particularly JRPGs and the Final Fantasy series in particular, traditionally party status in combat scenarios is displayed somewhere along the bottom third of the screen, most commonly in the bottom right, which shows the HP, MP, status effects, and turn time for each of our characters in the party. And this pattern extends up to and including the more action-centric titles, such as Final Fantasy XV and the Final Fantasy VII Remake, all of which retain this kind of traditional aspect of gameplay and design. Now, the essence of this JRPG mechanic is so that the player can orientate themselves and cycle through each character's turn during combat, but more crucially, so that the player can determine battle strategy and understand at a glance how their party is doing. And for example, status ailments will show up on the character avatar and often alongside their name in the modal along the bottom. Likewise, low health will highlight as a colour change, such as yellow, indicating that the player should probably cure that particular party member. And we have other stuff such as limit breaks and elements like that, which are flagged up on this unique display block to help navigate a particular battle, and as I say, determine how our party are doing. Now, looking at Final Fantasy XVI's combat design based on the gameplay trailers we've seen thus far, we can see that the party status is absent, and screen real estate is pretty much exclusively allocated to the player character, so very much a far cry from existent Final Fantasy patterns, and very little chance of getting party status at a glance from this particular layout, without fundamentally changing the UI patterns as characters are added or switched, which isn't ideal and would be quite a jarring experience for the player, I think. So this brings us on to Dragon's Dogma and Suzuki's resume as a game designer and combat designer, because this title took quite an interesting approach to displaying party status, and indeed incorporating party gameplay through its narrative premise and system design, which has its pros and cons, as we'll discuss, but it may well be an indicator of the gameplay sort of dynamic that we find in Final Fantasy XVI. Now, chief among the combat patterns in Dragon's Dogma that answers the single-player action-centric display style is that allies and party members have their health and status displayed above their avatars in the actual field screen, much like we might see in older brawler beat-em-up style games, and even some real-time strategy games. And the solution here is that the real estate of the screen is freed up to focus on the player character and all of their attributes and status and stuff like that, while still allowing that glancing view of how our allies and teammates are faring. And naturally, this method lends itself to party members that are AI controlled rather than playable, and the Dragon's Dogma companions are somewhat appropriately known as pawns in the game world, because they are simply automatons and AI controlled. And it seems likely, and I think has actually been confirmed, that Final Fantasy XVI will also rely on AI controlled companions as well, which again leans towards this system that's used in Dragon's Dogma. So the pros and cons of this system are that, yes, you are freed up to focus on your own character's statistics and abilities in the game, and that's what you see in the HUD. But equally, we could argue there's a degree of immersion breaking with having stats displayed over the party members in the actual field screen. And Dragon's Dogma, which itself has a lush sprawl of vistas and world to explore, it is impacted slightly by the status symbols appearing around your party, the colour coding and stuff like that, which combined with all the VFX flashes of combat, it can create quite a chaotic scene that again is more reminiscent of action titles rather than RPGs. Secondly, without having the static modal displaying party stats at the bottom of the screen, like in earlier Final Fantasy games, we are reliant on keeping an eye on our surrounding party members, and unless we are all focused on the same enemy and in the same proximity, so viewable in the screen, this can result in having to swivel the camera around to find our party and see what's going on, which I suppose is an exercise for the developers in creating adequate AI, enemy locking, and system design to sort of circumvent that sort of issue and player frustration. And finally, in conjunction to the status appearing above the avatar, there's the reliance on other means to communicate to the player what's going on with our party. And this will reasonably be through barks and dialogue, so AI kind of shouting status or issues at us, and of course kind of victory statements and stuff like that. But also looking to some of the clumsier applications in Dragon's Dogma. We have the minimap, which flashes up with colour-coded markers of where our party is, which turns into a skull if they get KO'd. And this isn't necessarily bad game design, but it is a bit clunky, and the onus is on the player to check between the field screen, the minimap screen, and listening out for dialogue to ascertain what's going on with our party. So personally, I don't think Final Fantasy XVI will go exactly down this route, and at any rate I haven't seen a minimap or a compass in the Final Fantasy XVI gameplay, but it does raise the issue and these questions of how they can intuitively communicate party status without a static set of data available on the screen to sort of convey that to the player. But as I say, I think, Dragon's Dogma came out over a decade ago. There's been huge advances, and it's a very advanced team that will be working on this. So I'm not too cynical that they're going to have issues with this party-based gameplay. So there we have it. That's a brief take on Dragon's Dogma and that approach to displaying party information in an action-based combat system, and using an AI party, of course. And I do feel that this is a viable and probably quite good route for Final Fantasy XVI to take, providing they can iron out these complexities of orientating and communicating party status on the screen to the player. And for example, if there was a timed KO for AI allies, where they'd automatically revive after 30 seconds with minimal health, or something like that, that may negate the need to flag up KO status really obviously elsewhere on the screen. And similarly, if they were to pin the AI characters to Clive, kind of similar to Final Fantasy XII, where everyone was quite closely stacked, the AI party would be very unlikely to be out of view too much. So that's another solution that would improve on the patterns that were established in Dragon's Dogma 2. But again, also raises considerations around enemy locking and issues like that, which actually was a criticism of Final Fantasy VII Remake. Slightly beyond the remit of this discussion, but it is one of those complexities and considerations for combat system design that does crop up when we're including and thinking about AI elements and AI allies. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this short episode. And feel free to drop a comment. Let me know your take on Final Fantasy XVI and the approach to AI party members.